welcome back to the Chelsweets kitchen. So as you can see, we have a very special guest today. We have Georgia of Georgia's Cakes,
Hi.
all the way over from London today, and we have collaborated to make this epic drip cake. I can't even talk. I've had too much sugar. Like my mouth is like glued shut. But Georgia is an amazing cake maker and a social media phenomenon, and she actually just hit 100K on Instagram.
Yay,
so congratulations! But tell everyone a little bit more about your cake business.
So I've been running my cake business for 3 years, but people were really interested in finding out how I make my cake, so I started more videos on my social media. It's all at Georgia's Cakes if you want to check it out, and I've also done a YouTube channel now, which is also Georgia's Cakes. But none of them are quite as crazy as this one. I think this kind of really tops it.
It's like literally like as tall as we are.
Yeah.
So we're going to walk you through how we made this cake, from adding the sprinkles and the drips to stacking it and adding on all of the different types of candy, which are both American and British.
Yeah, which we tasted as well, so we're a bit shaky.
We started off by building the bottom tier of this cake. So we added a bit of buttercream to our cake board to secure that cake layer, and we then began to assemble our 8-inch tier. So this is made with 4 layers of my go-to chocolate cake recipe, and we wanted the flavor to be a nod at a Victoria sponge cake. So a Victoria sponge cake is a classic English cake that is usually made with vanilla sponge cake and filled with raspberry jam. We decided to add a bit of strawberry to mix things up, and then Georgia topped it with some more vanilla buttercream. She used a small offset spatula to get this layer really nice and smooth, and then she repeated this process with the remaining cake layers. It was such a nice change of pace having Georgia over to help build this cake, because there were going to be 3 tiers, and it's nice being able to watch a little bit instead of having to do all the work myself. So once Georgia had frosted and stacked all 4 cake layers, she added on a bit of extra buttercream to the sides of the cake and the top to allow her to create a thin crumb coat around the cake. So first she worked around that extra buttercream using a small offset spatula, and she then smoothed the frosting using a bench scraper. It's so interesting how, despite the fact that we're doing the same thing with all of our tiers, everyone has their own style. So as you can see, to smooth the frosting off the top edge of the cake, Georgia likes to use a small offset spatula and then scrape the excess onto her bench scraper. So she got her sides super nice and clean, so we popped that into the freezer to allow it to chill, while I worked on the middle tier. This tier is made using 4 6-inch cake layers, and it's made using the same batter as we used for the bottom tier. To flavor it, we decided to add some peanut butter and caramel, and I warmed up the peanut butter in the microwave for about 15 seconds to make it easier to spread. Once I had smoothed it on top of the buttercream, I added a very generous drizzle of caramel. So this is just my no thermometer caramel recipe, which is so easy to make. It's only 5 ingredients. If you've never tried making it and you want to see a tutorial, you can click the link in the upper right corner. Or if you don't feel like making caramel from scratch, you could always use store-bought caramel. The flavors of this tier are inspired by a bunch of my favorite candies. I couldn't really pick just one, and several of them include both peanut butter and caramel, so it seemed like a very natural flavor combination. Once my layers were stacked, I also added on some extra buttercream to create a thin crumb coat around the cake. I began smoothing with a large offset spatula and then used my bench scraper again to get the sides really nice and smooth. I like to use my bench scraper on top of the cake as well, which is where Georgia and I kind of differ in our technique. As we let that middle tier chill, I've decorated our last cake layer, which we filled with kind of crumbled up twirl bars. So twirl bars were one of my favorite English candies that Georgia brought over, and they just have such an amazing texture, and it's such good quality chocolate. You really just have to try them. It's hard to describe. But we crumbled these up between each layer to add an extra bit of texture and, of course, to pack in some more chocolate flavor. So this tier is made with 4-inch cake layers, and we used 4 cake layers, so it's a very tall, very thin tier. It was a little bit difficult to frost, and as I assembled it and it got pretty tall, I just was very gentle as I was adding my frosting and smoothing. And you could use a dowel if you were worried about your layers sliding or if you were having a hard time keeping them upright. But I think as long as you have a gentle touch, you can get this accomplished without a dowel. So I used the same technique as before of just spreading a thin layer of frosting around the cake and then smoothing it using my bench scraper. Once the sides and the top of the cake were nice and smooth, we traded out this tiny tier for our large bottom tier. So next, Georgia added our second layer of frosting onto our bottom tier. And normally I want to add a really thick second layer of frosting because I want to make sure that none of the cake is visible through it. But since we're going to be covering this in sprinkles, it's not quite as important to have such a thick layer of frosting. Georgia likes to use a roll method when adding sprinkles to a tier. So as you can see, she's spreading a ton of nonpareil sprinkles into a baking tray, and then she's placed cardboard cake rounds on both sides of her cake to enable her to lift it up with her hands and literally roll it sideways through the baking sheet. So as she's doing this, she's going to get as much as she can on the cake, and then she's going to redistribute the sprinkles by shaking the pan a little bit, and she's going to continue to cover the cake in sprinkles. So this method is so fast, and I think a little bit easier, but also a bit scarier than just using your hands. So I loved watching her do this. I've never done this method before, so it was really great to see it in action. Next, I got to work on our middle tier. So I added a second pretty thin layer of frosting, and I then used my hands to gently pull the sprinkles up the sides of the cake. So this method definitely takes a bit more time than George's method, but I think is a tiny bit less scary. So it really comes down to preference. You can do whatever you're most comfortable with, but now I'm inspired to try the roll method. So I also added a thin layer of frosting to our top tier, and once it was smoothed, I used my hands again to cover it with sprinkles. So this one went pretty fast just because it's such a small tier. But we did still end up using a ton of nonpareils on all 3 layers. So I have a giant jug of sprinkles that I think is about 8 pounds that I got on Amazon, and I highly recommend buying in bulk if you're going to do a cake like this, just because it does require so many sprinkles. Next, we added in some thick bubble tea straws to act as supports in the cake. So when you're making a tiered cake, the bottom tiers can't support the weight of the tiers that you're placing on top of it, so it's really important that you use either large straws or wooden dowels to help make sure that the cake can keep its structure. Once the supports were in place, Georgia added on some chocolate ganache drizzles using a bottle. So Georgia usually likes to pour her ganache on top of her cake and then use an offset spatula to spread it out and have it drip down the sides. So this was a little bit of a different technique for her, but it was fun to see her use a squirt bottle, and she did such an amazing job with it. I repeated the same steps on our middle tier, adding in the bubble tea straws to support that top tier, and snipping them to just the right height and pressing them into the cake. Next, I added on some chocolate ganache drips, and I was actually worried that mine were going to end up looking thicker than Georgia's because the ganache had cooled, and it was creating thicker drips than when Georgia had used it, and it was a bit warmer. Luckily, because these tiers are so tall, they all ended up being long, beautiful drips, and it actually had a very cohesive look in the end. Here's a quick peek at us adding the drips to the top tier of the cake. And as you guys can see, each of these tiers is very tall. So when we stacked it, the cake really had amazing height. So we covered the entire top of the top tier with ganache and then got to stacking. So we allowed the cake layers to chill in the freezer for about 20 minutes so that they were easier to handle. And we also added some buttercream on top of each tier to help kind of keep everything together. Once we had stacked all 3 of our tiers, we began to decorate the cake. Georgia started off by adding some beautiful lollipops to the very top, and we then filled in around the sides with all of our different candies. I wanted to include our candy taste test in this video, but it ended up being literally 20 minutes, so I made a separate video of that. So if you're interested in seeing it, you can click the link in the upper right corner. It was so much fun, and I really learned a lot about English candies. So we set to work adding as much candy to this cake as we possibly could, and we fit it into every nook and cranny.
I think we filled every possible bit of space with candy. It looks amazing.
So, I know, me too. It's like, literally it is taller than us. How tall do you think this is? Like,
I reckon,
you guys
like,
have meters instead of
yeah, but I also use inches, so I'm like 20 inches, maybe even more.
Actually, okay, so we're gonna have to do a little. Okay, so this is 18 inches. Oh, it's about 18. Perfect. 18 inches. Wow, that's definitely the tallest cake that I've ever made.
Really?
You probably made like 4 tiers.
I've made taller, but this is definitely the craziest.
So as silly as it sounds, because we spent so much time creating this cake, to cut it, we decided to disassemble it. It just makes it so much easier to actually get a clean cut and to make sure that the cake doesn't tumble over or lose its shape. When I removed that middle tier, I did end up taking off some of the bottom tier's top frosting and top cake layer, but that's okay. So we cut into our top tier first, which, if you remember, was the twirl flavored cake tier. And it had the cutest little slice since it was such small cake layers. So once Georgia finished cutting into that one, I sliced into our middle tier. So this one was the peanut butter and caramel tier, and this was my personal favorite flavor. It was delicious, and it also cut beautifully. The last thing to do was to cut into that bottom tier, which Georgia did the honors of, which was the one that was flavored with strawberry jam.
Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like it, and if you don't already, subscribe, and also be sure to check out all of Georgia's social media channels. Your YouTube,
Instagram, and Facebook, I guess.
Facebook is still a thing.
Yeah, so all Georgia's cakes, you'll be able to find me.
And let us know what cakes you'd like to see next, and if we do ever get to do a collaboration again, if I ever go to London or you come back to visit New York, what we should do next time. So thanks so much for watching, and see you guys later. Bye!